Questions and answers, yes. How long have we got? 10 minutes? 10 minutes. He's very dictatorial, this man. All right, we've got 10 minutes. Phillip Braddock, who it's lovely to see you here today.
To be deliberately provocative.
Microphone.
I wouldn't say I agree with every comment Bob has made, but I agree with much.
I should hope you wouldn't.
I agree with much. But in relation to Huawei, my understanding is that the British have restricted it to, I think, about a 30% participation in relation to 5G. Previously, their engagement with Huawei required them to undertake at Huawei's expense, to undertake a great deal of interrogation of the equipment to ensure that it wasn't being capable of intercepting information that they may not want them to receive. In other words, we took the view that it was better just not to have them.
Yep.
The Brits had to pay a very substantial premium in order to deal with what was a real issue that needed to be addressed. Would you agree with that?
Yes, with this qualification that Huawei was seeking in Australia and was rejected in Australia for what the British have given it in the UK. So core and non-core, Huawei was saying in Australia, we're just proposing to do non-core, and Australia made the decision in August last year or the year before, they wouldn't be allowed to do non-core. The British have said Huawei can do non-core.
Okay.
So it's a...
John Cleary.
There's another discussion that's taking place in the newspapers every day these days. It's about lack of confidence in government. People have lost trust in government. We've had the benefit in sort of my generation of growing up since the 1940s in a world that was building international institutions. In the 1980s, Reagan and Thatcher said government's the problem. So from the 1980s on, we've had this, let's get rid of government, let's diminish the role of government. You've alluded to it in foreign affairs, but we're seeing it in all sorts of other places. One of the things I had the privilege of doing as an ABC journalist was one of the last interviews with Nugget Coombs before he died, one of the great heroes of Australian sort of bureaucratic structures. And he said he was afraid that what was happening was the relationship between the parliamentary side and the professional side was breaking down, and that he was very concerned that over time this would erode the very nature of Westminster parliamentary systems. We've seen Trump strip out, in the American system, foreign affairs. You've alluded to cuts here. The Bridget McKenzie thing, the sports rorts, seems to be epitomise exactly that, where you have this tiny little argument that says, oh, there was a minor breach and so she's not guilty, despite the fact that the Auditor General is able to say there was a major breach here. You have a political appointee in the office saying, no, this is not a problem. Is this not a quintessential example of something that is a major challenge for Westminster democracies at the moment? This fusion or breakdown of the relationship between politicians and the independent advice.
John, it's a very big question. We could have devoted all this evening to the role of government. I've got two instincts. One, as an amateur historian, to ask whether this has perhaps always been the case. Is there anything new about this? Could you go back to any stage in history and not find a raging disaffection with how our political masters are behaving? So I think we've got to test your propositions against that. And my other perspective on it is, now I'll leave you with that thought. Is it really that different now than at any time in the past?
I think it is, but let's move on from there.
Well, just to be a contrarian, isn't it the role of people to be disillusioned, and the role of politicians to let you down? But I also think as the leader of a government, he thinks the answer is for a decisive intervention from the Prime Minister's or the Premier's office to set things right, that reassures the electorate that there's someone with good character and sound judgment and a bit of an ethical sense who's just going to cut the head off an errant minister. And if there's any doubt, cut the head off the errant minister.
But we still have to have ministers who accept frank and fearless advice from their public servants, and they're not doing it. Let's move on, Dr.
Yeah, but the minister's in charge, and it's legitimate for a minister
of course.
to say to public servants, "I've heard your advice.
Yeah.
I've heard your advice, but I disagree."
But we have a
Now
prime
your
minister who
job
says
is
he doesn't want to hear it. Doesn't want to hear the advice.
doesn't even want to hear it. All right,
That's
well,
right.
that's a valid point.
Yeah. Alison Broinowski.
Thank you, Bob. Very enlightening, the whole thing. Can I take you back to a really fundamental question? We have had, since your day, an increasing element of bipartisanship in foreign policy in Australia. Do you think that the absence of difference between Labor and the coalition on matters relating to defence and diplomacy is something that we need to change, something that is in fact endangering us more than it assures us of the kinds of things that they say it does? I mean, your examples from trade are obvious, but as Malcolm Fraser said, we've got dangerous allies. And as he argued in his book in 2014, the fact that Australia is in danger is actually caused by the presence of American bases on our soil more than any other factor. How can we get through to the Labor Party the need for leadership in this area and the need to take a few risks that say we will develop a fundamental foreign policy of our own as a middle power in the way you've described? How can that be got through to your party?
Well, there should be a confidence in the party that enables to happen what happened under the Hawke and Keating governments. That is, an Australian foreign minister or an Australian defence minister to go to Washington and say, "I'm here to talk about the chemical weapons treaty, or I'm here to talk about a Cambodian peace accord. Now, we're at odds with you, but I want to lead you through the arguments." So we should be confident enough, and we haven't been in recent years, to try to talk the Americans out of bad notions. How much better off we'd be if we'd attempted, we would have needed Tony Blair to have gone along with us, to talk the Bush administration out of an invasion of Iraq. We wouldn't have ISIS, for example. It wouldn't have been heard of. It wouldn't be there. We wouldn't have had that surge of instability in the Middle East. The notion that Australia can talk America out of its worst instincts and persuade America to embrace its better instincts is no longer with us because we haven't got the confidence. We ought to have the confidence. I mean, Mike Pompeo is not, and the others who've come and gone in the Trump years, the Trump administration, shouldn't terrify us. They're workaday politicians. We're entitled to sit down with them and say, "We're a good ally, here's the checklist, we're doing all these things together, but we disagree with you on this, we're not elevating it in the media, but let's talk about it. We think you got China wrong in these respects, we think you got it right in some respects, and we want to work with you that, but let's just go through it." We're not doing that. I think for the Labor Party there's a specific problem. There's a notion in the Labor Party that will be accused by the Conservatives of being weak on national security issues. Therefore, we've got to overcommit to a consensus position. And I think if you look at Australian public opinion, there is enough unease with America in this mood. Look at the Lowy poll about attitudes to the US under Trump. To embrace an opposition that says, "Oh, we support the American alliance, but there are big disagreements here, and we would aim to work them through with Washington." I think that'd be a more appropriate approach and more popular with thoughtful Australians than simply saying the government struck a position on a national security issue. national security agencies are always right. We embrace them.
But it can be done. I mean, it was done in relation to Australia taking a different position in relation to the International Criminal Court, when Bolton was here arguing that we should be signing up to it.
That's a good example. What year was that, Philip?
I've forgotten the year, but
Yeah.
I know when Bolton came and I know when I'm meeting.
Yeah. So when you were attorney?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you minister then?
I was attorney.
Attorney General, yes. Other questions? We've got time for one more.
I mean, you can handle this one,
Quentin
Mary. I
Dempsey.
remember just another example, and I wouldn't claim credit for it, but the well-established Australian position, one I inherited as minister, was support for something called the Arms Trade Treaty. It applied to small arms, including rocket-propelled grenades, and Australia was one of a group of nations promoting this Arms Trade Treaty. America had difficulty embracing it because, would you believe, the position of the National Rifle Association. So I was able to raise it. I was able to raise it with Joe Biden, meeting him in the White House. Very intelligent, thoughtful politician. He was able to say, yes, look, we understand what you're saying. We've got a bit of domestic political pressure here. We're working our way through it. You can raise these matters, and the role of Australia as a middle power is to take up the chemical weapons, arms trade treaty, international criminal court. As a middle power, we've got a big stake in strengthening and not weakening international institutions, so many of them now being trashed by American first dictates.
Right. Last question, Quentin Dempster.
Thank you, Richard. Bob, thanks for your insights. You started this talk about the existential threat to humanity and all species through the fires of climate change, which we've just experienced. Can you explain, even now, why the paradigm in this country hasn't shifted, where the government will not make any substantive acknowledgement of the reduction of CO2 emissions from this country? You know how the Leviathan forces work in this country to, in many ways, control our domestic politics. Why is it that our current government can't go much further than the status quo, even though your once great party now finds itself with Albo as the most preferred Prime Minister? Why there hasn't been a bipartisan acknowledgement of the threat, not only to this country and its well-being, but its role it could play as an international influence on a better world response to this existential threat?
Yeah, well, let's close in on something very, very specific. I won't answer your question with generalities. I'll answer them with something very factual. Labor went to the people at the last election saying we can get 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. Seemed very bold. The coalition attacked it. This would be the end of the Australian way of life.
As we know it.
Do you know what? According to experts, including Garneau, including to a group of academics at the ANU who I've recently interrogated, we're on track to do it because of the surge of investment in renewables coming down in price, and the investment decisions being made by boards of directors who have got a heavy legal responsibility to avoid entangling their corporations in stranded assets. The big four banks are putting no money into coal. One of them used to have untold tens of millions in coal. It's got it down to 10 million. Another one of the big four banks has got nothing exposed to thermal coal. The challenge is for someone proposing investment in these areas is finding a bank, a superannuation fund that's going to put money into it. Ross Garneau says we will make a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. Bold as that sounded in the election last year, we will get there providing the government's not drawn to subsidise coal. So technology and international finance, investment decisions and pricing decisions are getting us there. Therefore, there's a case for a bipartisan and consensus policy that says the thing is to fix up the grid and storage. the grid and storage to see that all those renewables can flood into the consumer market.
Sure.
Trump is pulling out of Paris. Do you know what Garneau says? Garneau says the most encouraging thing on the world scene is the Chinese commitment post-2030. The worrying thing would be if the Chinese, seeing America pull out of Paris, would say, you know, in the Politburo, well, the pressure's off. The pressure's off. Why should we adhere to the closure of coal-fired power with the sacrifice that involves in Liaoning province, or which has already got 10% unemployment? Why should we do this if America's pulling out? I said to an American group recently, we won't beat climate change without American ingenuity. But on the world stage, the biggest villains in climate change are the US Republican Party.
Yeah. I think on that note, Bob, we'll end this discussion, not quite the way I wanted it to end, but never mind. That's very good. Now, look, it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for your insights and your experience. And I'd like to now call upon Justice Michael Pembroke, on behalf of Affinity, to present a small gift of appreciation to you, Bob.
This is a small gift from Affinity for you.
Oh, beautiful.
We hope you like it. I've been asked to read to you the artist's description of what it portrays. I hope you understand. Ebru, a traditional Turkish art, is formed by sprinkling natural paints over a basin of water. This art received the name Ebru, meaning cloud, to describe the cloud-like image that formed after the paint was sprinkled over the water. This work displays a battle-style Ebru with a Turkish miniature painting of a white dove over it. It illustrates the metaphorical dispersion and falling apart of dark clouds by the white dove of peace.
Beautiful. Thanks very much.
Thank you.